So this review has been a long time coming. ARCAM announced their new flagship streaming integrated amplifier at High End Munich in May of 2024 and released the 5th generation Class G amplifier in fall of the same year. This dynamic titan is certainly indicative of a company who focuses on perfecting past products while simultaneously incorporating new technologies into cost-effective packages. Stick around while I share my listening notes with the ARCAM SA45 streaming integrated amplifier in my system. Quick disclaimer. You'll note in the footage of the SA45 in my room, there was some minor damage to the top of the cabinet that occurred during shipping. I apologize for not having an unblemished specimen for filming, but I trust you'll understand. Okay, theoretically, Class G amplifiers afford designers an opportunity to do the same with less. That is, for a given output, Class G could be smaller, lighter, and run cooler. One look at the SA45 would lead one to believe that the engineers at ARCAM may have flipped that theory around. When compared to many Class AB amplifiers on the market, the 17-inch wide, over 15-inch deep, and nearly 6-inch high chassis is certainly not smaller. And at just under 40 pounds, it's not lighter either. Its chassis is relatively limited on venting, so maybe it runs cooler, although I did no testing to confirm this. I surmise rather than holding constant a specific output specification, the design team at ARCAM set out to give listeners more output using similar dimensional, weight, and thermal budgets to those set by manufacturers of Class AB equipment. The result? A 180 watt per channel streaming integrated amplifier with a large, roughly 9-inch high-resolution display, all for $5,499.95 US. Inputs and outputs are not in short supply on the SA45, meaning this piece affords you many opportunities to grow your system. In addition to the obvious multi-way terminals for your speaker connection, outputs include single-ended pre-out, a pair of single-ended subwoofer outputs for stereo subs, balanced pre-out, and again a pair of subwoofer outputs, this time in balanced XLR form. For inputs, there's a USB connection for attaching a storage device and an Ethernet port to feed the onboard streamer. To feed the onboard HyperStream IV ESS DAC, digital inputs include 2 optical SPDIF connections, 2 coaxial SPDIF connections, and 1 HDMI eARC connection. That last one may sound minor to a lot of you, but I feel that with the ability to easily and seamlessly incorporate the SA45 with your television, this solidifies its position as a bit of kit that's bound to be in your system for many years to come. Analog inputs consist of a pair of balanced XLR and 5 pairs of single-ended inputs, 3 line level and 2 phono stages, 1 for moving magnet and 1 for moving coil cartridges. As if the plethora of IOs wasn't enough, the SA45 comes with Dirac live room correction built in, although I have yet to find a system where this has been executed well. While going through the measurements using the included microphone did supply the amplifier with a filter for my room, it seemed to take a lot of the life out of the music. Now my room is quite heavily treated and is therefore already very kind to the sound waves filling it. So maybe if you're in a position where you don't have the ability to incorporate a lot of treatment into your listening space, you'll get more bang for your buck here. At any rate, I feel including Dirac adds to the sense of value one gets when purchasing the SA45. I would like to briefly touch on UI and UX. This was partly the reason for the tardy review. When it arrived, the SA45 was still going through the Roon certification process, and Qobuz had yet to launch the much-anticipated Qobuz Connect, something ARCAM was near the front of the line for implementing. Every one of these wrinkles were ironed out with simple over-the-air updates. Yet one more feature that makes me confident prospective buyers will get their money's worth. Getting back into UI, for all intents and purposes, it's relatively straightforward. The onboard streamer has the capability of serving streams directly from the top streaming services using each service's Connect functionality or from a Roon server on your local network. There is no native ARCAM app for streaming. The ARCAM Radia app is primarily used for serving music from the attached USB device. Additionally, I found the app to be the most efficient way to update the unit when those OTA updates were available. Other than that, the Radia app's functionality is pretty limited. The settings for the SA45 are accessed either by using the two knobs on the front face or with the included remote. Menus are well organized. However, although it has an 8.8-inch full-color display, I found the text to be a bit on the small side and did most of my setup by sitting directly in front of the unit. This small text size was again noteworthy while streaming, as album metadata displayed on screen seemed unnecessarily small. Everything was legible from my listening position, but just. And it left me thinking, couldn't this large screen have been used a little bit more efficiently? Regarding the remote, I found the icon-inspired buttons to be straightforward and intuitive, making navigating simple from the comfort of my listening position. For my auditions, streams were sourced from both my Roon server as well as using Qobuz Connect. I also took some time to stream from my reference DCS Lena streaming DAC and master clock using the balanced input. Power was conditioned using an AudioQuest PowerQuest 303, Ethernet was switched through an English Electric 8 switch, and for speaker wire, I used my Via Blue SC6 Air cables. This was also the first piece of review equipment I had an opportunity to evaluate on my new Quadraspire SV3T rack. More on that in an upcoming review. Okay, before getting into sound quality, we need to define our roles. Here at the Absolute Sound, our primary source for comparison is the sound of real instruments played in a real space. The experience of listening to music played live provides viewers with a much more universal encounter than a comparison to other equipment, which viewers may or may not have heard. Although that comparison can be helpful sometimes as well. Therefore, my job is to share what I heard as compared to the Absolute Sound, and your job is to decide if that comparison aligns with your voicing preferences. So here we go. I'm going to start with the obvious. The most prominent characteristic of the SA45 is the amount of bass energy it outputs. Recognizing that Harman, who now owns ARCAM, has done a lot of research to better understand consumer preferences, the design team at ARCAM took the work of Dr. Sean Olive to heart. At mild to moderate listening levels, say 65 to 75 dB, this emphasis on the bottom octaves was noticeable but subtle. However, when increasing amplitude, it didn't sound as if the octave-to-octave levels were increasing in uniform fashion. That is, when listening at what I'll call party levels, the slope sounded less subtle, emphasizing the bass even more. Now, I might argue this might be appropriate for many listeners. It certainly put a smile on my face. And I'll bet if you're using the eARC connection, action flicks will certainly sound more engaging. To those of you seeking to achieve the absolute sound with your equipment, you may be left feeling dissatisfied. Although oftentimes when I'm listening to recordings for the purpose of comparing equipment to the absolute sound, I'm doing so at mild to moderate listening levels. Because when I go to a symphony, or listen to a jazz trio in a lounge, or hear a quartet live, rarely do average levels get all that high. Live, unamplified music is just not that loud. This meant the SA45 played acoustical pieces in a believable way. Sure, there was a gentle lift in the mid-bass, but at live level, there was nothing distracting about this. At increased listening levels, it did sound as if the output level took priority to control. This is not to say that the bass output at higher listening levels was out of control, simply less controlled than other equipment I've heard. My reference Hagel H190V, for example. But at party levels, Aren't you listening to party music anyway? Here, synth bass is commonplace, and the majority of that is pretty diffuse and doesn't require a ton of definition. And the SA45 sure made it sound fun. In fact, the apparent focus on the bottom end meant the top end of the spectrum was gently laid back. Therefore, fatiguing peaks in the upper end of the spectrum had their edges pulled off, leaving for smooth listening for hours. A trait this voicing preference lends itself to is a slight veiling of the performance. While the SA45 is certainly not opaque, there is more transparent equipment out there. Now, going back to your preferences, you may actually prefer this less transparent option. A benefit drawn out from this characteristic is that most all recordings played through the SA45 were enjoyable and engaging, regardless of the mixing and mastering. Oftentimes, with more transparent equipment, listeners have to cherry pick the recordings they play. Some albums are just not engineered that well, and more revealing equipment will make this abundantly clear. Now, where the SA45 really excels: dynamics. Dynamics are generally impressive. A track I like to use for assessing macro dynamics is Mountains, composed by Hans Zimmer for the 2014 film Interstellar. I typically use the ticking clock in the background to set the initial level, as this piece starts out soft. The build in this score is impressive in its own right, and the way the SA45 rendered this was remarkably engaging. On the microdynamic side of things, the SA45 was seamlessly tapping into the high gear of its Class G architecture frequently, while I listened to Pierre Favre's solo album Portrait. Transients were tight and packed a punch. Another noteworthy characteristic here was the decay of the bells. The way the SA45 rendered this sounded so natural as they simply rang into nothingness. Touching a bit on imaging, the soundstage presented by the SA45 was well sized and allowed for a believable performance to be projected. I will say though, I felt the built-in streamer and DAC were holding the amp back a bit from its capabilities. This was when I made the swap to my reference DAC, the DCS Lena, which has a built-in streamer as well. Without a doubt, with the Lena, the sound was more natural and the image presented had more air. The stage was wider and had more depth with more nuanced layering. This offered an even more believable rendition of the piece being performed. Quite honestly, this isn't a fair comparison of streaming DACs, but what it does show is, again, the SA45 provides a great starting point for a stereo system, on which one can build when the time comes. It's got more to give. Okay, well, for a flagship product from a time-honored brand, I'd say well done. Although the ARCAM SA45 is a Class G amplifier, don't expect smaller, lighter, or cooler. This thing is a beast. The SA45 is powerful, dynamic, fun, and built to grow with you. It's a seriously capable amp that doesn't take itself too seriously. With a plethora of I/Os, you're sure to have a great starting point for your system if you choose to purchase one, although it's a great bit of kit on its own. Thanks for sticking around while I shared my listening notes with you, and if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to make listening fun again.